The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels. She joins Myth Vision today, and we discover really how Satan was used in the first century, second century, even down till today. But what was Satan's origins, and where did this come from? What is the point? Is this a spiritual being or a human? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also putting together a GoFundMe. I'd love to see you guys help participate to have in-person interviews with Elaine Pagels on all of her works, her Gnostic Gospel series and everything. Go down in the description, help us make it possible. I really hope you do, because I'm going to fly out there like I'm doing all these other scholars in person with my hardware and make history. Have your questions asked. Help support us. What do you say? We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. You can see the caliber that I've brought to the show today. I'm super excited about this because I've been wanting to get an interview with Dr. Elaine Pagels, or Professor Elaine Pagels, for quite some time now. And let's go ahead and just say welcome to Myth Vision Podcast, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm super happy about you joining us today. I finished your book, The Origins of Satan, a few months back, and I said, hold on, I need to reread this. There's so much detail in there that is so powerful. But first, let's introduce who you are to the audience. And Elaine Pagels is an American religious historian. She is the Harrington Spear Payne Professor of Religion at Princeton University. Pagels has conducted extensive research into early Christianity and Gnosticism. Her best-selling book, The Gnostic Gospels, which was written in 1979, examines the divisions in the early Christian church and the way that women have been viewed throughout Jewish history and Christian history. And the Modern Library named it as one of the top 100, if you will, in the 20th century for books. Her education, and maybe you can tack on if there's anything I've missed here. You had a bachelor's and a master's at Stanford University and a PhD, of course, at Harvard University. Am I missing anything?
No, that's the basic stuff.
I'm sure your rap sheet goes on, and I'm going to show everybody. Take a peek, everyone. Go check out her website. It's down in the description of this video right now, ElainePagels.com. We've got a little dash between Elaine and Pagels, and there's a hilarious clip here you must watch. I don't know how you kept a straight face in that discussion.
Well, that was with Stephen Colbert when he had his show, you know. And when I was asked to be on the show, his manager said, well, you know, you should understand his purpose is to make you look ridiculous. And I said, I got it. You know? So you have to be the straight man with Stephen Colbert. And it was very funny.
I thought it was hilarious when you finally said to him, you were like, well, since your religion is an authoritarian religion, I was thinking, what's he going to say? He just like nodded his head like, yes, ma'am. He's a really nice guy. I could tell, though. He was really fun, I'm sure.
He's very funny and charming. And actually, he's a serious Catholic, but he's not a literal minded Christian. He's quite open, obviously.
Absolutely. And also, ladies and gentlemen, you see I've got the recommended book in the description, the link to the recommended books. Go and get her books. She has written more than words I've said in this life. I mean, she has covered so many topics. And I do want to interview on all sorts of different books that you've written on this. The Gnostic Gospels, Revelation. I'm excited about that one. Why Religion? You told me, look, we need to check these out. And this leads me to the question, while plugging and saying, everybody go check this out, why are you fascinated with this topic?
Well, that's a great question, because some of my friends think it's weird. But I grew up in a sort of culturally Christian home in California. And although my father gave it all up for Darwin, he gave up a kind of ferocious Presbyterianism. And as soon as he encountered science, he changed it and said, well, those are just silly old folk tales. I have nothing to do with that. So I didn't take it very seriously. I love poetry. I love music. I love dance. You know, that's what I was doing. But when I was 14, well, I was living in a very boring town. It was Palo Alto. There was nothing to do. And I was invited to San Francisco. I thought anything happening in San Francisco is more interesting than Palo Alto. So I was going. I didn't know what I was going to. It was a Billy Graham crusade. Now, who is Billy Graham? I didn't know. But there were 18,000 people in the sports stadium where I'd seen, incredible baseball games. I mean, it was phenomenal. And there were 6,000 more in the parking lot. And there was this extraordinary preacher talking about America and the sins of America. And I'd never heard anyone talk the way he did. I was really stunned. And then he said, but you can be born again, and you can start a whole new life. And wow. And I was 14. I thought that was irresistible. So I just loved it. I went down with the altar call. I was born again. And it opened up a whole world, kind of like another dimension. I felt like I'd been living on a flat earth. And suddenly, the flat ceiling is lifted and you are living in a world of God and Satan and Jesus. And it's a huge universe. And it's much bigger than your family household, in some little middle-class town. So that was great for about a year. And then I had to get out of it. I don't know what takes people out of those groups. You told me you were in one. But what took me out of it was that a friend of mine in high school who was 16 was killed in an automobile accident with other friends coming home from a party. And when I went to my evangelical friends, I said, this happened. And they said, no, that's terrible. Was he born again? And I said, no, he was Jewish. And they said, well, then he's in hell. And I just felt like somebody had sort of punched me in the stomach. It was such a blow. I thought that has nothing to do with what drew me here. You're talking about the love of God. What? Wasn't Jesus Jewish? Really? So I never went back. And I just hung out with my maverick friends who were playing music and doing a lot of things that we used to do in the 60s. And years later, so I went to New York to study dance, to become a dancer. And I found out that I was pretty good. But you can't be pretty good in New York. You have to be fantastic, or I'd be waiting on tables. So I thought, okay, plan B. And I thought something about that experience with that Christian group, even though I couldn't stay in it and I couldn't live, it seemed like such a small world and a very limiting one. Something about it was powerful and really meant something to me. So I was trying to figure out, well, so what do we know about Jesus anyway? How do we know it? So I decided to go to graduate school and find out. And I didn't want to go to any church school to get brainwashed. So I chose a secular school. And, who is Jesus? What do we know? Well, the first thing that happened when I got there is I found out that my professors had file cabinets full of Gospels I'd never heard about, right? The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Are you serious? And this stuff was about 2,000 years old, genuine early sources, written about the time the other Gospels were written. But they had been called heresy by fathers of the church for the last nearly 2,000 years. And so they were burned, they were buried, they were thrown into the river, they were destroyed. And the only copy that was found hidden in a cave in Upper Egypt, where it had been for nearly 2,000 years. There were actually 51 ancient, mostly Christian sources along with it.
Wow.
So we're saying, what is this stuff, So I started to read the Gospel of Thomas, which is just a 14-page list of sayings, which it says, these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Judas Thomas wrote down. What? So the church later said, well, there was no secret teaching of Jesus, but there was. If you read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, it says that Jesus taught his disciples secretly about the secret of the kingdom of God. And he told them things he didn't tell outsiders. So what I learned, Derek, is that the Gospels of the New Testament are telling us what they say Jesus taught in public. But these secret Gospels claim to tell you what he said in private to certain disciples.
If I may, I must ask, because I asked this of Dr. Ehrman, and this was wonderful question, especially in your vein of expertise. Do you think Morton Smith forged the secret Gospel of Mark, or do you think that's authentic?
I don't know. I think it probably is authentic. I knew Morton a little bit. I was a graduate student when he was a professor at Columbia. But he wasn't a fake. I don't think he was a fake. There are lots of, that's the thing. There's so many secret texts and Gospels that we never knew about. He found that at the monastery of Saint Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai. Well, that library has been there since the 3rd century. Mm-hmm. And you can find things there that you don't expect, I found the oldest manuscripts. I'm sure that Bart Ehrman told you about that.
Right.
So,
and
So, there were lots of things. And I don't think Morton made it up, actually. That's just me.
No. And I appreciate it. Because
when you read Fathers of the Church, the ones who are Orthodox, and Orthodox means straight thinking, it always reminds me of orthodontia, it's about straight teeth. Well, straight thinking is what the bishops wanted you to get. So that's what's in the New Testament. And this other is what they think is really weird material. Actually, there are good reasons for that.
I was going to say, you also talk about, there's some things that sneak their way into the New Testament, though, that give us huge red flags. So when people talk about let's back up, because we could talk about the New Testament. We're going to get into this. You spend quite a good amount of time in your book on the origins of Satan in the Synoptics and in John, and showing there's a difference. There's obviously an evolutionary development taking place on the idea of Satan and vilifying the Jews, but we're going to get there. I figure it'd be good to start with, when someone reads the title of your book, they're either thinking, all right, this was a righteous, angelic winged figure, like a seraphim that was in heaven, close to God, like the closest to God's creation, the way the story's told. Michael, the archangel, comes up, kicks butt with the other good guys, and knocks him out of heaven. There's this battle. But then there's also the Jewish idea, and they kind of have Satan as God's pit bull. He obeys and does everything that God, tells him to do or permits him to do, in all in accordance with God. He's not an enemy.
In the book of Job is what you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. Yes, ma'am. And Satan takes on different facets, if you will. He's not the same in every place. And maybe you can elaborate on the history building up to what we find in the New Testament, and then we'll get into more after that.
Yeah, I never expected to write a book about Satan because I thought he was kind of a cartoon figure, frankly. Horns and a tail, that kind of thing. But I had some really challenging times before I wrote that. And somebody said, "Are you angry at God?" Actually, our 6-year-old son had died of a very rare disease.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And it was awful. And somebody said, "Are you angry at God?" I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." That's where a question that my friend Bart Ehrman would have asked. Why aren't you angry at God? That doesn't make sense to me. I thought it'd be nice to be angry at someone, but there's nobody to be angry at. In the ancient world, they'd say, well, it's Satan that does this. Satan is known as, his name Diabolos means someone who throws obstacles in your path. So he does bad things like he does to Job, to sort of, make you miserable and get you at your worst. So I thought, okay, I'll write about Satan. Maybe that's a way of dealing with my own feelings and anger and frustration, because I don't believe in Satan. So I started looking at who told these stories about Satan. And first thing I realized is, this is a surprise to me, raised Christian. He's not there in the Hebrew Bible, hardly at all. Only, like as you said, in the book of Job. In a couple other places, there's a figure who's a kind of adversary, but he's really part of God's army. The angels are the God's army. That's how they're pictured in the ancient world. I mean, God is an emperor with a huge retinue and a court, So I began to look at why people told stories about Satan. And what I realized, and you can check it out, anyone who takes Satan seriously and says, hey, Derek, Satan's trying to take over this country. Whoever says that and means it is not just talking about some spiritual forces up in the stratosphere. They're talking about people. And they can give you names and addresses. They know that there's God's people and there's Satan's people, and they know exactly who they're talking about. So what I realized that stories of Satan, when they talk about God and Satan contending good and evil, they're really talking about our group, us and them. The good people, God's people. We're always God's people, whoever we think we are, right? And those people, whoever we think they are, who are Satan's people. So I called it a social history of Satan. That was my personal name for that book.
Wow.
Because how can an invisible person or imaginative person have a social history? Well, Satan does. Because it's about how people see other groups.
This is powerful. I must make a poke. I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I have some scholars that come on, they're PhDs, and they're mythicists, right? They're not in academia. And their proposition is that Jesus was an angel, right? Which that means he wasn't historical, which would go outside of the academic world. But one of their arguments is, and this is one of the things that you did so nicely in your book, they said, well, look, Jesus was crucified by demons and things like that, as Paul seems to portray, like the archons of this age. And what you did was so wonderful. You connected, yes, they were superstitious. Yes, they thought there were spiritual forces at work here, but there were people that were vilified and as the enemy. And this is why I loved your book so much, because it's not just spirits in the heavens. It's not just people on earth. It's this cosmic on earth as it is in heaven type of cosmic battle, which is the prayer that you hear Jesus talk about, on earth as it is in heaven. There's like this spiritual / real world idea that they had. And so it takes this and makes it reality on earth, which makes more sense for the historicists. But
you're exactly right. And that's what was different about my work. Other people had talked about religion as ideas and fantasies, imagination, invisible beings. And I want to say, yeah, okay. But what's it about? It's about issues that are right down here on earth. And it's about groups that are split. So when the followers of Jesus, like whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark, he said, well, I want you to know from the start, the Spirit of God came on Jesus when he was baptized. And the Spirit of God was with Jesus. But it drove him into conflict with the Satan. So Jesus's life is seen as a struggle of a man who is contending with the Spirit of God and Satan. And that is played out right here on earth. And all of that is when people, Christians, evangelicals, liberals, whoever they are, Catholics, Protestants, you name it, they're all talking about life here on earth in some specific way. So I wanted to write, what's going on here? So I was looking at the New Testament. I thought, okay, so in the New Testament, this writer is saying, well, Jesus is on God's side, okay? Who's on Satan's side? Well, I thought, well, it would be what? Who? It'd be the people who crucified Jesus. That would be what? The Romans and some of the Jewish leaders who participated. That's not what I found. I was really shocked. I thought I knew the New Testament. I've been teaching it. But I never noticed that in Mark, Satan is only identified with Jews and Jewish enemies of Jesus, and never with the Romans who actually crucified Jesus. I mean, Jews didn't crucify Jesus. He was crucified by the Romans because he was considered somebody inciting revolution against Rome. crucifixion is the most horrible penalty, and it's reserved for slaves and traitors to Rome. And Jesus was regarded as that. So I thought, wow, this is amazing. Because we know historically, who crucified Jesus? The Romans did. Only Romans had the equipment. You have to have an army to do that. It takes equipment, it takes technology, it takes soldiers. Right. And the Romans did it a lot. I mean, they crucified thousands of Jews on the same charges in the first century. Jesus wasn't unique that way. In fact, about the time he was born, there were 2,000 Jews crucified near Nazareth for starting a rebellion against Rome. So, but religious people see this in terms of God and Satan. So I thought, this is so weird. Why would the followers of Jesus effectively exempt the Romans and blame Jews for what Jews didn't do? And I would realize the story was told as though the crucifixion was engineered by Jews, even though Romans did it. Historically, Derek, that doesn't make sense. They didn't have the means. They didn't have the legal right. They couldn't have done it. So I had to figure out why. And I finally realized that these people, followers of Jesus, were writing right after there was an enormous Jewish revolution against Rome. And in fact, it was such a huge revolution, like the American Revolution, trying to get rid of the British. These were Jews trying to get the Romans out of their city and their city of Jerusalem and out of their land and stop dominating all the nations that the Roman Empire dominated. But they lost the war because the Romans had massive military power. And they went into Jerusalem, and 60,000 troops, they devastated, they massacred thousands of people. They destroyed the entire center city and burned it down. The temple of the Lord was burned down, and Jesus and his followers were his followers then, who were still alive. That was 30 years after his death. Were regarded as followers of a convicted revolutionary. So if you were a follower of Jesus 30 years after his death, they'd say, well, that man, he's a follower of that Jesus of Nazareth, that revolutionary. He's probably one of them. Mm. And so they were crucified. Peter was crucified. Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens got quicker deaths that weren't as painful. Jesus' brother James was stoned to death in Jerusalem. Horrible way of dying. It takes a long time, like crucifixion. So they didn't want to be seen as revolutionaries because it was so dangerous. So they basically told the story of the death of Jesus in a way to sort of say, well, okay, Romans did it, but it was the Jews who instigated the whole thing.
Do you think that was to save their hide? Or
yes.
Do you think there was, let me ask you this, do you think there was any historical verisimilitude to the idea of Jewish sects disagreeing with a historical Jesus who's preaching some message, and he's facing guys on earth at this time that are actually rejecting him and actually saying no, and that gave them ammunition to say, look, not only look what happened in 70 AD, because you didn't listen to the guy, we're blaming you guys. You didn't listen to him, and God sent the Romans as punishment like he did, to the Babylonians, whatever else in the Old Testament. I don't know.
Well, you're totally right. That happened a little bit later, but early on, and there were Jews who thought Jesus was a heretic, and he was a troublemaker, and some people thought he was a revolutionary, but likely the evidence suggests that to me that he wasn't. Some people claim that he might have been, probably not. But his followers were not starting a revolution, but they were under suspicion. So basically, yes, I think it was a Savior hide thing, because it means, look, our leader was arrested for being and crucified for being a revolutionary, but it was a false charge. His own people ganged up against him, and they accused him of things he wasn't guilty of. And that's what happened. And the Romans wanted to release him. They knew he was innocent. Pilate was such a nice guy. Well, if you look at the history, Pilate wasn't that way at all. He crucified people without trials all the time.
I'm not laughing about the seriousness of it. I just think
Yeah.
it's funny because it's like, this is interesting. Yeah.
Oh, it's so fascinating because when you study the history of religion, Derek, it changes the way you see that whole collection of stories. It doesn't change everything, but it just changes the angle. So I began to realize I started looking at stories of Satan as kind of a joke, the cartoon figure. And I came right up against the real world, just like you say, the real social world, and how followers of Jesus had really demonized Jews. And that was not a problem as long as they were being hunted by Romans and crucified and executed. But when they came into power in the 4th century, they legislated laws against the Jews. You could be burned alive for converting someone to Judaism. And in the Middle Ages, in the Holy Roman Empire, Jews were considered the killers of Christ. And they were hunted and they were targeted and they were, it's absolutely horrific to see how Christians have treated Jews for thousands of years if you start to study it. Jonathan Carroll wrote a book called Constantine's Sword about this, and he stopped being a Catholic priest. He said he was so appalled by the treatment of Jews when he realized what actually happened. So then when you look at the 19th and 20th century, the Holocaust, if you look in Germany, Hitler was actually, his propaganda minister was a Christian, believe it or not, Joseph Goebbels. And he said, Hitler is bringing in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That's why it's the Dritte Reich, the third kingdom, is the third millennium. And he's coming as the forerunner of Christ, and he's getting rid of all the Jews who are enemies of Jesus. Ooh. And Jesus wasn't a Jew, if you read Nazi propaganda. So anyway, you can't blame the whole Holocaust on Christians, but there was fuel for that fire.
It did have religious motivation for
even in the New Testament. And I was so shocked to see it because I'd never noticed. And my professor at Harvard said, there's nothing anti-Semitic in the New Testament. And I said, have you read it lately? I mean, I didn't actually notice it though, because it's kind of woven into the story of the crucifixion in a way that I hadn't noticed. But if you read anti-Semitic propaganda, to this day, Jews are called Christ killers. I gave the book to a friend of mine. He said, I sat up all night reading it. I didn't know why they called me a Christ killer in Boston. I'd never killed anybody.
Oh, wow.
And really, I talked about this recently at Stanford University, and 4 Jewish scholars in our group of it was a research place. They said, hey, we don't know anything about the Bible. We just know one thing, that the Jews killed Jesus. And I thought, whoa.
Yeah, see, I've interviewed with Rabbi Tovia Singer. He's a Jewish apologist, and his goal is to try and obviously, stop Christians from trying to convert Jews to Christianity. And so he deals with a lot of fundamentalist Christians. But he was talking, and I think this is a perfect segue to get into the Gospels a little bit, to hear your insight on the evolution, so to speak, of what's happening. We briefly touched it, but in your book, you actually go and show examples. I don't expect you to necessarily have to pull up examples, but Mark starts off, and it doesn't really carry the depth of anti-Semitism, whereas Rabbi Singer believes that Matthew's actually more anti-Semitic than what people give credit for. And one of the reasons he did, and this is just an example love to get your insight on, he says, you got a GPS for a star that's directing you to where the Messiah is. Now you have to stop at King Herod's palace. For what? To ask him where you got the star directing you. Why are you asking him where the Messiah is? So he said, the point is, he thinks, is that the author's trying to say at every turn, the Jews don't get it. And they're blamed. Blame the king of the Jews right here for wanting to be a Christ killer himself. He's wanting to hunt the Messiah. That's anti-Semitism. What do you think?
I think that's true. And what Matthew is saying there is that when Jesus is born in Bethlehem, who comes to give him gifts and worship him.
Gentile, foreigner, strangers.
The representatives of all the Gentile nations, because the three magi, the three kings, represent the three nations of the world as seen from the Hebrew Bible. And the Jewish enemies of Jesus are, like you say, are trying to kill him. And then Jesus goes up on a mountain and gives you he gives you the Sermon on the Mount like Moses. I mean, he's pictured like Moses, but it's a book that appeals deeply to people who love the Hebrew Bible. But as you say, the four Gospels are written after the death of Jesus. Mark about maybe 40 years after, Matthew and Luke 50 or 60 years after, and John maybe 60 or years after. And the further you get from the history, the more hostile these get to the Jews. If you look at John 8:44, right? Jesus is speaking to Jews who did not believe in him. And he says, you come from your father, the devil. They say, our father is Abraham. No, you come from your father, the devil. And in the story of Jesus's crucifixion in John, Jesus says to Pilate, Pilate says, your own people turned you over to me. And I've got nothing against you. I mean, Pilate is Mr. Good Guy, and he wants to talk to Jesus about philosophy. But the Jews are trying to kill him. The Jews hate him. In Matthew says the whole people shouted out, crucify him. This is totally anti-historical, I believe, for reasons I show in the book.
If I may, and this is a great point you bring up, it goes right into the you are of your father, the devil, or Satan. When we go back into the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and we find this narrative of the serpent in the garden, Revelation harps on this. Now, in its original context, I get it. This didn't mean necessarily what they make it mean in the New Testament. Context is oftentimes rehashed throughout the Bible. Even in the prophets, it means something different than it did in its original context, maybe in the Pentateuch. Yeah. But my question gets to, and this is going to lead us also into the Gnostics in a way, but right now I wanted to center on the Gospels. There's the idea and argument in Genesis 6 that these are giants. Why? It's clear that the Mesopotamian backdrop to the source material here is pulling off the Apkallu, and there's all these giant heavenly sages that are teaching mankind all of these tools of civilization that they're not supposed to do, and they're annoying the gods. Depending on the source you get, they're too noisy, and they're doing the labor for the gods, and the gods are like, look, send them a flood. Well, in the Bible, it's different. It's wickedness and cruelty, and they're being very abusive, or they're bad. They're being very wicked in the way they approach. Let's flood them out. Well, Jews say that this is actually not divine giants, angels, or Elohim, small gods. These are humans, and it's the line of Cain. So this whole friction that happens, we know Second Temple literature, Jewish literature kind of indicates it's giants and Enoch and other things. But then you also have this idea that these are real human line, bad seed people. And the New Testament seems to act like from righteous Abel to righteous Zechariah in Matthew, he talks about the blood's going to come down. Well, who killed Abel? Cain. Who's Cain? Is he the father? What is going on here? Can you tell me what you found out about this?
Well, you just have there's a lot of stories packed into that. But where I thought you were going to take it, Derek, was that Christians, as I was taught in church, when I was in the evangelical church, from which I learned a lot, that the serpent in the Garden of Eden is Satan. But he's not Satan in Jewish tradition. In fact, Satan isn't even there. I mean, he's just a clever snake, right?
Right.
He shouldn't do what he does, but he's not a power of evil. But if you look at paintings like Michelangelo's famous paintings of Adam and Eve, or you look at Christian paintings, you will see the snake is pictured as the serpent. I mean, is pictured as Satan. So Christians imagine that Jews always talked about Satan, but they really don't. They do talk about fallen angels, as you say. But it's quite an amazing story to think about the Bible not as something that dropped from heaven, written in divine script, but some stories that people told because they were trying to understand things. They were trying to sort out what was going on right here on earth. And the stories about Satan are part of that. But the problem with the stories of Satan today is that they teach us that conflict in the world, your conflict with anybody, is basically a conflict between good and evil, right? And you're the good one, and whoever you really don't like is evil. You can't negotiate with evil, right?
Right.
You have to annihilate evil. And that's why you can't negotiate political disputes. This idea of good and evil is very powerful in war. It's been used in war by Christians for 2,000 years, up from the 7th century against the Muslims, through the Iraq War. It's been used by Jews. It's been used by Muslims. You kill all the people because your enemies are evil. They're not just enemies. It's not just a territorial dispute or something. So that is very unfortunate in a world in which war can destroy the entire planet. And I think we ought to unlearn it.
So in that vein of what I got from that is what we see in the New Testament, we're talking about the righteous blood of Abel down to Zechariah, is really a post-war scenario depicting why the temple's destruction, why judgment happened to you. But I guess what I was poking at is when the New Testament author, I think it's Matthew, or maybe was it John? It was John. You are of your father, the devil.
That's John.
Is he trying to say that you're from the line of Cain, or is he saying, what do you think is meant there, so to speak? Because I think there's an indication in Matthew where it sounds like it's this Cain idea. You know how the Jews talk about, no, they're not fallen angels. It's a bad line, a seed of humans, not fallen angels, or if you will, these giants aren't actual like supernatural beings. These are all humans. It's from the line of Cain that's wicked. Have you any idea how to rectify that idea?
Well, I'm not even sure. That's pretty complicated. But when John talks about certain things people do, he attributes them to Satan. Do you notice that in John's gospel, before Judas goes out to betray Jesus, it says Satan entered into him.
Right.
And Satan made him do it. So why did he betray Jesus? Luke says the same thing, that before Judas betrayed Jesus, Satan entered into him. So the crucifixion is blamed on this evil power. It's just, if you realize that people are writing these stories and they're writing them for a certain purpose, it does change your perspective. It doesn't mean you can't participate in Christian tradition, but you tread a little more carefully on what you assume is true about all this.
Powerful. Yeah, there's so much there to glean. I'd love to get into one thing you mentioned in your book is how the Jews expel Christians from the synagogue. And this happens to be something the Johannine tradition reflects and saying, whoa, we're not even allowed to go to synagogue anymore. Do you think anti-Semitism is what caused the Jews to expel them? Or do you think it was just they were a different breed of ideas that the Jews weren't having it?
Well, that's John 9. And what it suggests is that followers of Jesus were thrown out of the synagogues because the accusation the Jews make in John is that Jesus says he's equal to God. He basically says he's God. He says, before Abraham was, I am. So he claims the divine name that was given to Moses, the name of God. Jesus is God incarnate. And that message, you can't really be Orthodox Jew, because your prayer, if you're an Orthodox Jew, is, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. And if you're a Muslim, it is, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and God has no other sons. So Jesus is not acknowledged. So I think they rejected Christians from the synagogue because they were saying that Jesus was God. And that's blasphemy. I don't personally think Jesus claimed to be God. I think it is something that people later or claimed for him rather powerfully.
Well said. And that historical, we have good precedents outside of the biblical account to say that the synagogue rejection was in the 90s, I think, correct? Somewhere around there?
Well, likely so. Yeah, that's a possibility.
And I want to, closing the statement of Satan entering him to go do the deed, that answers the question in those gospels specifically on Satan being a spirit, that why would something enter him? So there is this supernatural respect here. It's not purely physical and only from a line of certain types of people. Don't get me wrong. It's utilized that way, but let's talk about the Gnostics. They flip this Genesis eating of the fruit narrative. This is a foundational question. And here's my question. As a Christian, I ask this. Did God lie? I mean, did God lie? In the day that you eat thereof, you will surely die. And
well, that's, some people thought that they interpret the whole story differently. You're talking about the testimony of truth, in which it says Adam, the serpent, was saying, you will not die. The day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you'll know the difference between good and evil. And that's what happens, right?
Right.
And so they say, well, who's the serpent there? The serpent was Christ. And how do you know the serpent was Christ? If you know the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. So Christ is compared to the serpent, which the serpent that is on the staff of Asclepius, the healer, the god of healing in antiquity. You still have the medical symbol of the Cassideus, the symbol of medicine with two snakes on it. That's for the ancient, god of medicine. And Jesus is there compared to the healer God who heals the world. But that story you talked about turns upside down. But Derek, I was saying, what's wrong with these other gospels? The Gospel of Thomas, it's just 14 sayings of Jesus, and half of them are exactly the same as you'll find them in Matthew and Luke. Blessed are the poor, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the sower, right? They're just the same sayings. Love your brother. What's wrong with that? There are other sayings there, however, that are, I would say, mystical sayings. And they say, the one I mentioned, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. The secret of the Gospel of Thomas, they say, is the secret of the kingdom of God. But what they mean by it is the kingdom of God is not a place in heaven. And the kingdom of God is not coming at the end of time, like the world is coming to an end and then will be the kingdom of God. It's not spatial and it's not temporal. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for insight that within you, there's a connection to God. You have within you a connection to God. All of us have a connection to God of which we may be completely unaware. How do we get that connection? We read Genesis. It says God created Adam, which means humanity in Hebrew, in his image. He created, in the image of God, he created him. So what's the image of God? Well, you can't make an image of God in the Hebrew Bible, right? You can't. You're forbidden to make an image. The only image that the prophets use about God, I think of Ezekiel 1. Ezekiel, the prophet, says, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. What did he look like? Do you remember that passage, Ezekiel 1?
When we're seated on a throne and there's the will within the will, or?
Well, the throne is moving. Yes, the wheel, that's a wonderful thing. Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air. But on the throne, if you look at the throne, Ezekiel chapter 1, you don't really see a being, a human form. It says something that sort of looked like a human form, but they don't want to say he looked like a human. But what do you see? You see light. You see rainbows. You see fire. You see lightning. You see glory. The Hebrew word kavod means shining. Right. So you see jewels and rainbows and fire and a sea of crystal. You see lightning. So the image of God that you can use as a Hebrew prophet is not a visual image. You can't make that. You can't make an image. It's light. Because light is invisible. Light is a spiritual energy. It's not a physical energy. Well, it is a physical energy in a way, but it's also like an invisible energy, and it's a metaphor for the divine energy that brought the universe into being. So when rabbis would read Genesis 1 in the first century, they'd say, God made you in their image. What? What image? Well, it's not the way you look. It's a kind of energy that brought the world into being, and that energy is in you. That light, we call it light, just it's a metaphor for that spiritual energy. And it's in you, it's in me, it's in everything, because nothing exists apart from the divine energy that brought the world into being. So that's what the Gospel of Thomas teaches as the secret. The secret is that you have within you a kind of spiritual energy hidden. You may not even know it's there, but it's connecting you with the divine source from which you came and which we all come. And so what you're supposed to discover as the secret of this kingdom of God is you're not just Derek Lambert. I'm not just Elaine Pagels. We are beings that came out of the light that came into being in the beginning of time.
And that's the Gnostic.
And that's a teaching which actually is the foundation of Jewish mysticism. If you look at Kabbalah, have you looked at any of that?
I have not delved into the Kabbalah, no.
Well, it's a deep well. But writings of Kabbalah you were forbidden to write it down. And because foolish people can be told, well, God is within you, so you're God. I mean, no. You could take it in a very naive and foolish way, right? So they said you shouldn't write this down for people who are not spiritually mature. But when they are, you can teach them about the divine light that's within every being and within everything in the universe. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, I am the light that is before everything. Everything comes forth from me. Everything returns to me. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a rock, and you will find me. That energy is in everything. Rocks, stones, stars, animals, us. And then the Gospel of Thomas teaches that's who you need to know who you are. It's not just this individual person with this gender, with this background, with this family. You are part of this astonishing spiritual energy from which everything comes. And when you realize that, you know what? You may not need a church.
Interesting.
You may not even need Jesus because he comes from the same light. You can find a way to God on your own. You can be a freelancer.
If I may ask a couple of probing questions on this is interesting because it makes me wonder two things. The Gospel Thomas seems to be dated pretty early in your estimation, at least, somewhere after 70, but where would you put it?
It was known to people who were writing in about the year 150. So most likely it was, we don't know for sure.
Right.
Early second century, between 90 and say 120 or 30, we just don't know for sure. So some people want to say it's very late, but late tradition can still preserve oral tradition in the ancient world.
That's true.
It doesn't mean anything about how authentic it is. It's just that you're not supposed to tell secret teaching, and that was supposed to be Jesus' secret teaching, which every rabbi has.
Could you tell me if... Oh, I got a quiet echo. There we go. The Gospel of John and Paul, is there this Gnostic teaching there? I mean, obviously, I am the resurrection. I am the life. Like that's a pretty bold statement to make. can you tell us any Gnostic ideas? And I use the term Gnostic. I know there's this debate of, was there really a Gnostic sect? Well, there were various sects with strange teachings that sound very Gnosis-like. But do you find Gnosticism inside of the New Testament canon? And then I'd like to probe another interesting question your way.
Many people have. The word Gnostic becomes a dirty word. It's derogatory. It just means these are the bad Gospels. Don't read those. I was told yesterday by a former evangelical friend that my books were always, he was always told they were dangerous because they can change your point of view. and these texts, Gnosis means insight, and it means insight about who you are, not so much who Jesus is. But if you know who you are, according to the Gospel of Thomas, you can find your way back to God because you have a secret link that you can follow inside yourself. And that's why you may not need a church. That's why you may not need a priest, a bishop, doctrines, Bible even. This is before there's a church, and before there's a New Testament, and before there's a Bible, the kind we have, and before there are Christian doctrines about the nature of Jesus. This was a mystical teaching that they say Jesus taught, and Jews have taught it for thousands of years. He was, of course, a Jewish teacher. If you read the New Testament in Greek, they're saying Rabbi, where we read teacher.
So this makes me want to ask about the Gospel of Thomas. When the disciples ask him, and this is an interesting verse, when will be the repose of the dead, the resurrection? And he says, look around. It's already happened. And they don't see anything happen. It's like, well, what do you mean it's already happened? The reason I ask is there is a group of people who want to suggest that the resurrection, like they, of course, can't, the whole canon is speaking, they're fundamentalists in their thinking. So everything connects and all the doctrines are all teaching the same thing. They believe the end happened in 70 AD.
Oh.
And so they're called full preterists. But this Gnostic idea, I told him, I was like, why don't you actually read the Gospel of Thomas to support your claim? Well, the reason is it goes outside of what they consider canon. But it's like in this book, he tells you the resurrection already happened. And I kind of wanted your thoughts on this, but do you think the argument of cognitive dissonance, if you will, might be what's happened within the Gospels? They anticipate an end to happen. It's supposed to end. They're expecting a world actual changing in this world change.
Yeah.
And it took a spin, and kind of like what we saw with the Millerite movement in the 1800s. The end is going to happen. And when it didn't happen, half the group said it did. It was spiritual, though. And the other half said, yeah. And the other half was like, well, we got the date wrong because nothing really happened. Do you think that's what happened with Christianity within the New Testament? And of course, the reason that the church continued, it never really ended. What was expected never happened. Do you think that's why they maybe spiritualized stuff in John, realized eschatology, as they call it?
Yes. I think that's a very good possibility. And it may be also why others say, well, what's resurrection? It doesn't mean the body gets out of the grave. It's a metaphor for spiritual awakening, what the Buddhists call awakening. When you become aware of spiritual reality, then you come out of being basically dead to the spiritual world. You come alive spiritually. So they said that's what it means. And you can consider yourself already raised from the dead. But Orthodox Christians said, no, it has to mean that the body was in the grave and then it's out. But that becomes a doctrine of the Orthodox Church. The resurrection of the dead means the resurrection of the body.
I wonder if they're right about it, only because they're pulling from Genesis, Adam, Paul, and he's saying, look, the first Adam all died, second Adam all will be made alive. And whether you make a universalist claim here or whatever, the point is like, does Paul think that actual physical death's what entered the world through Adam? And does he mean actual resurrection? And what does he mean? I mean, this is interpretation,
Well, we don't know. But if you look at, for example, at the 4th chapter of of Mark, where Jesus says, he's teaching the disciples, I'm only telling you the mystery of the kingdom of God. And then he doesn't tell them. The Gospel of Thomas says, well, I'm going to tell you what he really said. Because he only speaks in parables in Mark for the most part. When you look at Paul, 1 Corinthians 2:6, he says, look, we too, we speak wisdom among the initiates. We speak divine wisdom, which is hidden before the universe for your glory. When the archons crucified Jesus, they didn't know what they were doing. And as you said, the archons there are not simply the spiritual powers. They are the spiritual powers energizing the rulers of the world, who are Romans, to do it. But Paul says, we have wisdom. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because you people are babies in Christ. You're not ready for it. I can't do it. I can't tell you things. You don't understand anything. You're just babies. 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. But people who understand the way I was taught, he says, were taught by the Spirit in a mystical way. Spirit speaking to spirit. And we understand the deep things of God. You don't. So you just got the elementary version, and I've got the deep version, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because I can't write it down. It's really prohibited to write down mystical teachings.
This is actually like his own vision where he says, I met a man once. He's talking about himself, and he's saying things I cannot legally even mention.
Yeah, I can't tell you what I saw up there. I was lifted up into heaven.
Right.
But I can't talk about that.
Do you think that this is a mystery? I guess I'm trying to pin Paul down. Like, who is this guy?
Good luck with that.
I know. Like, do you think he claims to be a Pharisee, but what kind of version of a person is this? You see?
We have very little understanding of Jewish groups in the ancient world. You know, a lot of that was destroyed partly because the rabbis, like the Christian church later, wanted everything to come from them. And they destroyed a lot of sources. We found them at the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are many apocryphal writings, which means writings outside of the Hebrew Bible, mystical writings, talk about, ecstatic experiences, talk about mysteries. And I think sometimes that the secret Gospels of Jesus come from that mystical Jewish tradition, which is thousands of years old, and which Christians said, well, that stuff is heresy. He would never have said that.
Right.
I don't know. He might have. I can't say he did because we don't know. But I think it's quite likely that if Jesus taught as other rabbis in the first century did, he would have taught secretly to people he felt were on a deeper level.
Interesting. Okay, back to Satan, and then we'll start to wrap things up because I love this, by the way. You can tell that you have so much insight from reading the material and just immersing yourself with it that, and you're scholarly about it. You don't say this is you're very balanced in your approach on, I'm not sure, or I know, and so Satan.
There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. That's really true.
The Jews get vilified. We know this in the 2nd century. Early church fathers are literally vilifying them and saying, you Christ killers. But we see a turn take place here where now Christians are using the term Satan against one another.
Yes.
And do we see that in the New Testament? We see it used against the Jews, but is there hints of it in the New Testament with other gospels? Is Paul talking to Jews when he's talking about let him be accursed, or?
I don't think so. He's talking about people who do things that he thinks are despicable, like somebody living with his father's wife or something like that, some kind of sexual.
Or circumcision on a Gentile, right? Like that.
That's a question. I don't know about that. That's the book of Acts.
No, Galatians, when he was saying
okay.
another gospel, and I figured it might have been, anyway, sorry.
When he says, if somebody teaches another gospel than the gospel I teach, let them be accursed. Who do you think he's talking about?
For me, I would say I think it's the circumcisers. I think these people. But then again, he goes on to talk about
Well,
castrate yourself. Then if you're going to
he
circumcise,
talks. He's talking about Peter and James, most likely,
okay, this
because
is powerful.
Peter and James criticize him, and they say he didn't know Jesus at all. He never knew Jesus. Peter was Jesus's right-hand man, and James was his brother. And this Paul comes and says, well, I have a gospel to go to the Gentiles, and Jesus appeared to me up in the sky. And, Jesus had been dead by the time Paul said he saw him. And so they suspected that what he said wasn't true. And I think he's speaking about some people. You may think they're angels from heaven, but you know what? They're really not. I would curse them. He's very angry at Peter and James. That's the way I've understood that passage. Now, there are different ways to read it, I'm sure, because most Christians don't want to see Peter and Paul in conflict.
Because Acts mends them. But yeah, this is
I mean,
okay.
There's a lot that you have to sort of smooth out the story,
I think Paul does in Corinthians 2 call them super apostles. Like
yes,
he's
he does.
mocking them.
Oh yeah, those super apostles. I'm not like them, but I'm really better than they are because they haven't had the ascent to heaven that I was given.
Wow.
And they haven't had the revelations that I've had.
Do you think you think that when he said I met a man once, he's talking about the moment that he received these revelations?
Yes.
Okay. Absolutely.
And he say, look, I've had revelations. He says it in 1 Corinthians 2. We have secret wisdom tradition. We know divine wisdom. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but yes, I do know what it is, and the Spirit taught it to me personally. And if you're not taught by the Spirit, you don't have it. I mean, Paul is pretty certain about his message being the only one you should really listen to.
Powerful. And that's the one that really takes over the backdrop of the Gospels in Mark. I really think Mark is utilizing a Pauline tradition. What do you think?
Yes, very likely, but so are the people who write these other Gospels. They think of Paul as the great apostle, and they say what we care about with Paul is not just what he's written in his letters, but his secret mysteries. So there's an apocalypse of Paul among the secret Gospels that talks about Paul's trip into heaven. There are other claims that Paul had secret mysteries, and we can tell you what they are. Those people can't tell you because they don't know. They just read what's written in the letters. We know the secret mysteries he taught. And the fathers of the church said, no, he didn't teach secret mysteries. He said himself that he did, but we know he didn't. And Jesus didn't either. Of course, they're ignoring Mark 4:11 and 12, where Jesus says he's going to teach them privately. But the Orthodox line is that he never did that.
So let's mention the Gnostics and how Christians vilify one another before we exit.
Well, the Gnostics didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Christians. So yes, there were Christians who called them heretics. And so they said, heresy was inspired by Satan, by the demons. So you're just teaching stuff that devils have taught you, that Satan taught you. You're as bad as those other people, or you're worse. So yes, they use that. And then, Catholics and Protestants, right, in the history of Europe, were killing each other in the religious wars. They were burning at the stake, Catholics burning Protestants at the stake for translating the Bible into English, Protestants burning Catholics at the stake. I mean, it was a life and death battle because those people are evil and we are God's people. Both sides saying the same thing.
So technically everybody's Satan and everybody's on the right side from their own perspective.
It works that way. See, if you just say good and evil, then don't you think you're the good one?
I like to think so.
Well, so does everybody else.
Right.
And I've been called in certain circles, which you will understand, Elaine Pagan.
Oh, wow.
And people I didn't know this, but on some websites, that's what they call me. They say she's not really a Christian. And another professor in Atlanta at a theological seminary told students at Princeton when we were talking that I was trying to destroy the church because I'm teaching things that are contrary to church teaching.
What, if you could comment on that, what would you say to that person? Like, you're trying to factually present that there are more than one representatives, like you did on the show. I got to pull it up again. Here we are, right? On this, in this conversation. Oh, am I in the right one? Maybe I went to the wrong one. No,
if you go, you have to go into the one with Stephen Colbert.
Did I exit it? I might have exited. Nope, here it is. Okay, there it is. So in this particular interview you did with Stephen,
that's with Stephen. Yeah, that was funny.
That was hilarious. But you also mentioned, look, ultimately this tells us there were various forms of Christianity, and yours is just the authoritarian one, the one that won out in history.
Right.
And I ask everybody to go check your website out for sure. But that,
it's funny.
How do we know what came first? You know, like, how do we know which version of Christianity actually is the most original? Or, you know what I mean?
It's a hard question. I mean, Bart Ehrman will tell you that it's proto-orthodoxy, but he's just claiming that the Orthodox horse won the race. So the ones that that support that point of view are the racehorse to check, right? There were Christian groups all over the known world, from Africa to Egypt to what is now Britain and France and Spain and Iran and Africa. And they developed different ways of understanding the gospel. Wow. Because some of them had only one gospel to read. Some of them only read Matthew. Some of them only read Mark. Some of them, who knows? Some of them probably didn't read, and they heard preachers preach. Somebody probably like Paul.
Some of these other letters too that you've been reading that you have in the Gnostic letters.
And so there were many different versions of the Christian truth. That's why you have to claim that there's a straight thinking way to approach this. And we have it. Right?
We all have it. Everybody's right and everybody's wrong. Well, I ask everyone right now, please go down in the description. I'm telling you, if you're like wanting the book, it's not expensive. Go on Amazon, get her book. Also on Audible, the person that reads it does a fantastic job on the origin of Satan. Get all her works, because stay tuned. We're going to be interviewing her more. In fact, I'm hoping to put together an in-person trip. I'll set up a GoFundMe or something to make that trip possible, and to go and meet with Professor Pagels in person about her books and on subject matter, where I can interview her like I do with all the other doctors that I'm doing. So let's hope we can make this happen, make history. I'll fly out to Colorado and interview you on more insight that you have, covering all the books that you do. I got to read them, of course.
I would love to do that. The most recent one, Why Religion, as I said, it's not a history book. It's much easier to read. You can read it fast. It's short, but somebody said, why do you do this? I mean, the wonderful theoretical physicist I later married said, why religion? Why don't you study something with impact in the real world? And I said, well, why do you study elementary particles?
Well, I'm glad that you do. And I have to confess, this is the first video we've done. I have to confess, when I was a fundamentalist Christian, I heard your name. I saw you on a website with you give your comments on all of these Gnostic, like 90 something books. You've been around for a while doing this. And I said, no.
Bad stuff. Yeah.
Stay away from this lady, because I thought I was right. And you were working for Satan. That's what I thought.
Well, that's how it works, Derek. That's exactly how it works.
But today I think I'm on the right side. I really do. And what that is elucidating this information to a broad audience. And the more we know, I think the more we can break those solid walls down that divide us and make us love each other, to try and understand we're all humans. And I love your philosophy too. It sounds like this has impacted your personal life and your own journey. To some degree, you find a connection to this literature, it sounds.
Yes, and unlike some scholars and friends of mine like Bart Ehrman, I don't reject Christianity and think it's foolish to believe that. I participate in a Christian church that I happen to like a lot. It's quite open. It's an Episcopal church, which isn't too serious about dogma and rules, but it is an opening to a spiritual dimension, and it's not the only one. I mean, I think there are many other ways. One doesn't have to be involved in Christianity at all. I've been teaching a course with a colleague of mine this semester called Jesus and Buddha. And we've been looking at Jesus and Buddha side by side. And that's very interesting. There's another path there. Well, I don't think anyone has to be Satan necessarily, Derek.
Right. No, I love this. Thank you so much for saying that. I know somebody that I'm going to send that to that's going to love that statement at the end. And never forget, ladies and gentlemen, go down in the description. We are meditation.